Hello, Bio20, and welcome to the first lesson on the introduction to the digestive system. Today, we're going to be talking about the 4 different types of macromolecules, and eventually we will get to the enzymes that play an effect in how these are broken down. So today, you've learned your lesson if you can name all 4 of the macromolecules, if you can identify different structures, and this is going to be a multiple day kind of lesson. So when I say multiple structures, dipeptides, polysaccharides, those kinds of things, we're going to be working on these for a couple days. So if you can start that today, but really dive into it tomorrow, that would be great. You're going to be able to identify what the function of the macromolecules do in the body, as well as eventually, again, this is a 2-day lesson, we're going to talk about the chemical tests that show that macromolecules are present. So we're going to introduce today your lesson around biochemistry by talking about 2 really important ideas. One is a molecule and the other is a compound. A molecule, by definition, is formed when we bond 2 or more atoms together. So if we look at a compound, okay, this is when we bind 2 or more molecules or elements together. So if we look at our example, a molecule is something like an oxygen atom. Okay, oxygen is O2. So it's 2 atoms of oxygen bound together. A compound, on the other hand, is when we take 2 different elements, such as hydrogen and oxygen, and combine them together. And that makes water. So that's H2O. The reason we're talking about this is because when we get into the world of talking about macromolecules, we are looking at compounds made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So there's a lot of elements combined together to make these different macromolecules. The other thing we want to define is when we're talking about macromolecules, are we talking about something that's organic or inorganic? So inorganic compounds do not contain carbon. So if I'm talking about something like calcium, calcium is just calcium. There's no carbon involved in calcium. So calcium is an inorganic compound, okay? So if we look at our examples, salt, water, oxygen, all inorganic because they do not contain carbon. Where breads, proteins, and fats, you will learn, contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen together. So that means organic compounds contain a bond of carbon and hydrogen together. And we saw this example earlier of carbs, proteins, and fats. So really just the difference is that one contains carbons and hydrogens, the other just doesn't contain carbon at all. So we're going to talk about, as we move through digestion, how are we actually breaking apart the molecules and how are we building molecules? And we learned about building molecules back in photosynthesis, and we built like glucose. So when we talk about building something, okay, we call this process the dehydration synthesis. So synthesis means to build, okay? And we're taking smaller molecules and making larger molecules for them. So we're building larger molecules. Now, in order to do this, we have to lose water to do this. So hence the words dehydration. So dehydration, loss of water to build. Dehydration synthesis. So we're going to take off H and OH because that will make you H2O. And then what ends up happening is these 2 combine to make a larger molecule. So what we're going to learn throughout this first couple lessons is that glucose is something called a monomer or a monosaccharide. And what it does is it is the smallest version of a carbohydrate. Maltose is a bigger version of a carbohydrate. So in this example, I'm going from 2 small molecules to a large molecule. In digestion, we are not going to talk about this. We don't build molecules. In digestion, we break molecules down. So this process that I'm showing you here is found in photosynthesis when we make glucose. We have carbon compounds that combine together with hydrogens to make C6H12O6. So building of that molecule. What we are going to talk about a lot in this chapter is hydrolysis, the cutting of larger molecules to create smaller molecules using water. So lysis means cut, hydro means water. So hydrolysis. So we're going to go the reverse order this time. This time I have a larger carbohydrate called maltose, and maltose needs to be broken down. This is what actually happens in your body. When you eat a carbohydrate, your body breaks it down from a polysaccharide, which is really big, to maltose, which is a disaccharide, which is the second biggest one. So in hydrolysis, what we're going to do is we're going to add water in, because remember, water to cut. So it's going to go right there where those two compounds are connected, and it's going to break it apart into two glucose molecules, which then have the OH and the H back on them. So that's how we get hydrolysis, is we take a larger molecule and break it with water. Again, this is going to be very important as we speak about digestion and how things are broken down. So let's get into talking about actual macromolecules. So we're going to talk for 2 days about these because you really need to understand the importance of these different macromolecules to carry you through the rest of this unit. So carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the key part here, guys, is they're in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So they're always going to be C6H12O6, something like that. Okay, that's glucose. Now, their function is to provide short-term and long-term energy storage. That's a really key part about carbohydrates, is they're there to provide energy. All right. If you look at the chart on the side, you're going to see that we have a starch and glycogen, disaccharides, monosaccharides. Those are just showing you the different versions of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is like the umbrella term, the big term that talks about all of these. So in the simplest forms, which are known as monosaccharides and disaccharides, okay, you have simple sugars or double sugars, double meaning di, okay, so they're made up of two singles. So when you eat a carbohydrate, you eat one of these, a starch or a glycogen, and then it gets immediately broken down into disaccharides, which are versions. These are the three versions: maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Lactose might be something you've heard of if you know someone who's lactose intolerant. And then you have a monosaccharide. These are the smallest versions. So glucose, one fructose, one glucose, and one galactose. Now, lactose intolerant people are actually intolerant not to the version of lactose, but the fact that they lack this enzyme right here. This is called lactase. Without lactase, they can't break down lactose into this, and their body can't utilize it properly. So all of these words right here that end in ASE are representing enzymes that you're going to find in your body that breaks down carbohydrates. And we're going to later in this unit talk really in depth about those. So the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to carbs is the polysaccharide. So the polysaccharide now is up here at the top. So I already talked about these two. The polysaccharide is the most complex carbohydrate, and it's linked of multiple sugars. 3 common types are starch and glycogen, which humans eat and can utilize. And the third one is cellulose. Cellulose is found in plants, and we can't actually as humans break it down. Celery. If you've ever heard that celery has no nutritional value, you actually lose weight if you eat celery kind of thing, you might have heard those things. It's because celery is made out of cellulose, so we can't actually break down the key carbohydrates that are found in celery, okay? So starch and glycogen, though, are going to be the most important for us. And starch, okay, is the energy storage in plants. So think starchy potatoes. If you eat a potato, okay, you have starch. Glycogen is what we would get if we eat meat, okay? So it's stored in animals. So those are the two that you're going to really need to know as we move forward, that starch and glycogen are the polysaccharides that go into our body. Next, we're going to talk about lipids. Lipids are also known as fats. They're insoluble in water, meaning they don't mix in water. That's what insoluble means, okay? Now, the cool thing about lipids, most people ignore fats and are like, fats are bad for you. But the fact of the matter is they actually store much more energy and can give you way more energy than proteins and carbs if eaten properly. So here's an example of lots of different types of fats. So you have unsaturated fats, saturated fats, and trans fats. Now, when it comes to trans fats, those are the ones that are the bad examples of fats that always are like, you shouldn't eat fat. Okay, saturated and unsaturated in small amounts are very healthy for you and can be good for you. Unsaturated fats, okay, can have good effects on cholesterol. Saturated fats, on the other hand, can have bad ones, but you can still eat a small amount of saturated fats are bad, okay? You can still eat saturated fats. So how do we form a fat? Well, fats are formed out of 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So the glycerol is on the side in the green box, and when it combines with the 3 different fatty acids through the process of dehydration synthesis, so if you are building this is what it looks like. This is a lipid. Okay. In our body, as we digest, we want to break this down, so we go through hydrolysis and we get all of these separate entities. So again, I already talked to you a little bit about saturated and unsaturated, and here's what the difference is between them. Is a saturated fat is single bonds between the carbon molecules. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is going to go through this again. I apologize. Saturated is looking like this. So that's just every carbon has a hydrogen. Unsaturated means there's a double bond between the carbons. Therefore, it cannot have all the hydrogen. So you're saturated with hydrogen, you're unsaturated, meaning you don't have every carbon covered in hydrogen. Now, unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature, such as like olive oil. Saturated fats tend to be more solid, like the fat you find in like a steak or in other foods like that. Proteins are probably the most, I don't want to say the most complex, but they are pretty complex, but they're probably one of the most important because almost everything in our body is made up of proteins. There's so many different things made up of proteins. There's the structural proteins and the globular proteins, just meaning the way that they're set up. Now, our structural proteins are things like muscles. So we learned about muscles already, and we know that muscles, okay, can contract and all this stuff. They're made out of protein. That is why when you work out, they tear a little bit, those micro tears I talked about earlier, and then they can be repaired by protein synthesis, meaning rebuilding up of the proteins. Connective tissue, which is blood, which we've also learned about, has some protein in it. And then we have our globular proteins, enzymes, which we've talked a little bit about, and we're going to talk a lot more about. Hemoglobin, which you've learned about, is on red blood cells. Antibodies, which you learned are produced by B cells in our immune system. And then hormones, which we haven't talked a lot about, but we are going to talk a little bit about hormones in this unit. So here's the difference of how they're set up. So structural proteins are folded into 3D shapes, okay? So proteins are actually long strips of amino acids that just fold and fold and fold and fold. So that's what you're seeing kind of here. And then if we were to look at its 3D shape, that's what it looks like. So what are proteins made out of? They're made out of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. They're the little tiny pieces that link together to make up a protein. Your body can make or build, so synthesize, 11 of these 20 amino acids. There's 20 amino acids, we can make 11. The other 9 are essential, but we have to eat them in our diet. So an amino acid structure looks like this. It's got an amino group, it's got hydrogen and an R variant and a carboxyl group, okay? These change to give you different structures for different amino acids. Last but not least is the nucleic acids. The nucleic acids are part of your DNA, so something we're going to talk heavily about in Bio30. They make up DNA. A nucleic acid is essentially a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen base. So that's a nucleotide, okay? The nucleic acid is made up of these. So that is essentially the 4 types of macromolecules. We're going to dive in deep on 3 out of the 4. So as we talk through digestion, carbs, lipids, and proteins are going to become extremely important. We're going to still talk about nucleic acids a little bit, but it's not going to be something we continue on with in this chapter. So if you have any questions, please let me know.